Thank you very much, everyone. I want to say that when I was asked by my friend Aya almost 2 years ago now to come and would I be interested in giving a presentation at the Transplant Games, it was something that was really, really odd and foreign to me. And so I came up without much thought, I came up with this title. And over the last 3 or 4 days, I've begun to get a sense of some of the issues, some of the concerns and problems that might be facing the transplant sports movement, transplantation sports movement. So with a bit of reflection, I changed the title to this: 1322 and all that stuff. The development of transplantation sport, a view from the sidelines. Okay, I'm not standing here with any great knowledge of this field. I have, however, an understanding of how sport cultures change and transform over time. And the research in which I conduct in numerous settings around the globe reflects this. So this is the title as I know it now, 1322 and all that stuff. And this is derived from one of my favorite books, first published in 1909, entitled 1066 and all that. And it's a reflection of a sort of parody of British history as seen through the ages from 1066, a significant moment in British history. And the point of this presentation today is to address something that's not often considered in the world of transplantation, in the world of disability sport, in the world more generally. The shared vulnerability of the human experience. And that is something, based on the attacks that occurred yesterday in Nice, and all these sorts of issues that confront us as people on the planet. There is a shared vulnerability that we all experience. And I want to, in 30 minutes or so, I want to begin to unpack some of this material. So how am I going to achieve this aim? I will start with a brief introduction. I will begin by looking at how social cultural thinking can help us make sense of sporting contexts and social contexts more broadly. And in so doing, I will highlight, in a very, very informal way, some sociological theory that as a scholar of social anthropology I might embrace, but I'm hoping to make it somewhat accessible for a diverse audience here today. The difference between disability and transplantation and what I refer to as the APA recipe. Adapted physical activity is an area of research that lots of scholars that are interested in issues of disability focus upon, and it's an acronym for adapted physical activity. And I'm in part leading a movement, or I don't know whether I'm leading it or just being taken along for the ride, about changing that to be either adaptive physical activity or, as I say at the end here, inclusive physical activity. And the need for people within transplantation sport to engage and think about some of the things that the disability sports movement already has been through. Because there's some lessons to be learned, good lessons, but also some pitfalls that I would encourage you within transplantation sport to avoid. And so, by way of introduction, social cultural research is often predicated on understanding who it is speaking to you. Okay? And this talk comes sort of at the nexus between two strands of my research. Okay, the book on the left, Sport, Professionalism, and Pain, it's 12 years old now. It was is a detailed look at the impact of changes in sports medicine upon sporting culture. And the fact that professionalism and what leads to professionalism, commercialization, can have a huge impact upon the bodies, the sports people that engage in the practice. And one of the things that concerns me here is that athletes should not be forgotten in the context of transplant sport. And this research was conducted using ethnographic methods, and it positions me, both sets of research position me in a situation where I am Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a two-faced character. I love and am exceedingly passionate about sport. But I know that the institutionalization, the structures associated with the sport, the pressures that athletes feel upon themselves can have dire and negative consequences on individuals, on populations, etc., etc. And so the first, to the left is my research on sports medicine and the influence of the medical fraternity. And the medical fraternity is not always doing good, okay? We have to be careful about the power of medicine and the arrogance that comes with the fact that medics think they've got it sorted out. And the relationship between transplant athletes and medicine is a really, really strong one, much stronger than it is at the Paralympic Games, for obvious reasons. But we need to be measured in how we think about that. The second bit of research is the cultural politics of the Paralympic movement. It is an ethnography that I started collecting data when I was quite young. When I was an undergraduate at university and decided that I went to a liberal arts university is a matter of fashion in some places in North America at least. And after my first year, I had to choose what I was going to focus on, and I decided anthropology. And because of that, they said, well, whatever you do in your summer break, you need to take detailed notes about it. You need to set a chronology of your experience and explore the ideas surrounding whatever it is you do in the summer. And in that summer, I went to the World Games in Belgium, Disability World Games as an athlete, and I began the long and winding road of documenting this experience and change within the Paralympic movement. What I observe here, or what I've observed over the last few days and sort of as a flaneur through the internet, is that the transplant sports movement is where the Paralympic movement was in the late 70s and early 1980s. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's old-fashioned, it's out of date, and so on and so forth. But there are moments in the history of the Paralympic movement that you can still learn from. The community ethos is something that's really, really interesting and exciting for me, but also the division between different transplantation groups is something that I see as potentially problematic going forward. And the sort of the sense of religious zeal about the place is really, really warming to my heart. But it's something that needs to be, you know, when does religious zeal become cult-like, and so on and so forth. So there's a balance to be had in all of this. And first and foremost, the Paralympic movement, which I'm sure you're all aware of, the commercialism is destroying the Paralympic movement and the ethos behind the movement. And as transplantation sport moves forward, we need to be cautious. You need to be cautious of engaging with corporate sponsors and so on, because it comes at a cost. there is no such thing as a free lunch. So social cultural thinking in the context of APA. And I start off from thinking of a notion that was first written down by Ruth Benedict, who's an American social anthropologist of the Culture and Personality School of Anthropology. And she wrote, "The purpose of anthropology is to make the world safe for human difference." Now there's a certain delicious irony in that anthropology was started in the United States and Canada so they could oppress the indigenous native populations. Anthropology was started in the United Kingdom so that it could oppress the the colonies. And it's about controlling and understanding the culture so that it can be managed. But I think the point is really, really important. Human difference is something that should be celebrated. And anthropologists have done this in numerous ways over the years. And one of the things I think where transplantation sport and adaptive physical activity come together is that in transplantation, human body parts are seen as therapeutic tools. They're a way to enhance, extend life. Okay? And that's not dissimilar with what's going on in the world around adapted physical activity. In APA circles, notions of rehab, there are three sort of fields of exploration: rehabilitation, physical education, which ties in with notions of physical literacy and so on that were talked about earlier this week, and sport. And all these three components, I'm certain, exist within transplantation sport. And so there's a certain similarity between these two entities. And at the end of the day, and I stand up here saying this as a former Paralympic athlete, transplantation sport, Paralympic sport are all about sport with imperfect bodies, whatever perfect really means. So there's a sense that if you've lost a limb, or if you're born with mild cerebral palsy, as I've been, your body is not, in inverted commas, perfect. If you have a heart transplant, if you have a liver transplant, etc., your body is not, in inverted commas, normal. But there are some differences that we need to explore. Both worlds want to shun this idea of being marginal to mainstream society. Individuals with impairments in the context of disability sport are always trying to achieve some sense of normality. And my limited understanding of transplantation is that through different medicine regimes and so on, and maintaining the body in particular ways, that is the goal here as well. And so there's much more in common between the two groups than there is distinctive. And I think that they can learn from each other. Now, this, what I'm going to turn to next is social science light, if you will. And if anyone wants to engage in these topics more deeply, I'm happy to do that. But I think for the purpose of the audience here today, I'm just going to touch on things. Michel Foucault is was a French social theorist, and he came up with some really, really interesting ideas about the way in which society is controlled. And he explored many different cultural environments and settings and so on, and he did it from a social historical perspective. He looked at the history of the penal system in France. He looked at the history of medical clinics as well. His end game was about questioning the ideas, the differentiation between the normal and the abnormal. He was concerned about how things at certain times are considered normal and then throughout history change to be abnormal. And one of the reasons, like a lot of great social theorists, he had a huge chip on his shoulder. Okay? He was gay. He was a homosexual. He was an open homosexual. And he found it exceedingly frustrating that in the past, homosexuality, he could show historically that that was a normal way of being. But at certain points in time, society decided that that needed to go in the closet, as we might say. And so he was really, really interested in the technologies that control our behavior. And he adopted the notion of the panopticon, the central inspection principle. And this is a principle that was developed in London by the utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham. And if you go to London, and if you're touring around, it's not on any of the tourist maps and so on, but go to University College London Hospital, and you will see the first panopticon as Jeremy Bentham described it, in the old hospital. The X shape that was created, where there's a central corridor of power, where nurses and doctors would sit, and they'd be able to observe all their patients. This idea that we're able to be observed from all over is a way of controlling people. The image there is from an old French prison, where the corridor of power is in the middle and all these cells open to the center. And this has two important components to it. The fact that the people believe they're being observed all the time, and they know how they're supposed to behave, so they begin to control themselves how they perceive society expects them to be acting. And this is one of the things we see in bodies in society on a regular basis. The control that comes without control is really, really pervasive in society. The power that society has over us to behave in certain ways, to act in particular manners, and so on and so forth. At the College of France in 1974-75, Foucault began a series of lectures about abnormality. Now, he never got the opportunity to write these up. He was one of the first high-profile, certainly academics, probably that means he's ultimately not that high-profile, but one of the first people to pass away as a result of AIDS, HIV. And so he became very, very ill towards the end of the 1970s, and his productivity waned. And the idea of the gaze for Foucault is about staring. It's about controlling people by your expectations of them. And we've all had those discussions with our parents. You know, when I see my 76-year-old mother now, and I say something to her, she will say things like, "Well, I didn't bring you up that way. But I haven't been living at home for 32 years, so something in the lessons that you taught me is going to change." But there's this view that somehow our behavior should be controlled in a particular way. It controls what we see and how we act. Physical activity and sport exposes the body to this gaze. One of the reasons that we have difficulty recruiting athletes to disability sport programs is because of the gaze. Because your body's exposed. The difference in your body is exposed in the act of physical activity. And that can be hugely intimidating. And one of the things that's interesting about the transplantation sport movement is that the way in which it's organized, it's less about serious competitive sport. Yes, I know people win medals and they're having individual contests, but it's done by age groups. Something that is mystifying to me, that sport would be organized in age groups, but because it assumes that age is a legitimate categorization. Yes, our bodies decline. I'm about 1.5 kilos heavier than I was when I was an athlete. But my chest is 2 inches smaller and my neck is 1 inch smaller. So that weight has gone somewhere where it wasn't supposed to. The decline of age happens to us all. But organizing sport based on age is something that might be reconsidered. The gaze of the world is always upon us. And what I want to do now is to move to another social theorist, and one of the words that's often talked about when we move to thinking about the distinction between disability sport and transplantation sport is this idea that transplantation sport does not want to be stigmatized the way disability sport is. And that's very, very interesting in and of itself. So Goffman is a Canadian social theorist, and he wrote 2 seminal texts in the late 50s, early 1960s. The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life and Stigma, Notes on the Management of Spoiled Identity. 2 key ideas and concepts that we can bring to the fore from Goffman. Normalization. How far will the normal public go to treat the stigmatized as if they do not have a stigma? So that's normalization. Normification is the habitual and ordinary process that everyone adopts to be normal. Okay, so the hiding of my right hand when I'm speaking. Okay, I'm holding the table here because I've got a dodgy right hand and it marks me out as a spaz. And I use that as it's a derogatory term in English, but it's a term that's given to people with cerebral palsy. Okay, because of the spasticity that affects the right hemisphere of my body. And this comes from this fear, in a sense. Not my personal fear now, but this comes from a latent fear of staring and the visual exchange that goes on between people. Nobody in the world has ever walked down a high street in a shopping precinct and said, "Oh gee, I bet you that person's got a lovely personality." Everybody makes judgments on how people look. Because until you get to know somebody, it's really hard to have anything else to go by. And so staring in the visual landscape shapes our experience. And one of the things that's really, really interesting is the response of parents to children. If a young child stares, if you have young children, let them stare. It's their way of making sense of the world. By assuming that your child is staring and it's going to put somebody off, it's creating the obstacle for that young child. Why am I being told not to stare? What is wrong with that person? Why is that person in a wheelchair? Why does that person have a limp? Why does that person need a prosthetic limb? And so on. So the young child sees the world and observes the world and explores things through their sight and vision, assuming they have vision. And if they don't have vision, they'll be exploring the world in different ways. But staring is not a bad thing. It's only a bad thing if you start to categorize people based on what you see when you stare. And that's where that's what leads us to the problems of stigma. The idea that groups of people are celebrated over other groups of people because they're more closely related to the norm. And the power and influence of those decisions shapes the lives of people. Okay? Shapes the experiences that they have in the world. And the notion of steerable bodies and so on. And I often, when I'm talking to my students, my undergraduates about this, I often get them to think back to, you know, the movies from the United States or Great Britain, certainly. I don't know enough about foreign films. But from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, where you'd see streetscapes where everyone, because the films in part were in black and white, where everyone looks exactly the same. You know, all men wearing suits and hats and so on, and there's no differentiation in society. Now that is a hugely troubled time, I believe, and has led to some of the troubles that we're dealing with today. But if you go into the high streets of today, you can see greater variety in what people are wearing. The cultural intermixing of people has been accepted in all the societies, or the vast majority of societies that are represented in Europe. And what we need to do is we need to push those boundaries further to increase opportunities for acceptance of difference. And in sporting context, become like the Finnish Sports Federation for the disabled people, who embrace transplant sport and disability sport at one and the same time. Now, staring is one of the big differences between transplantation sport and disability. And it's something that really, really interested me, in that when I first arrived here, I was expecting this to be an event for highly efficient, highly performing athletes. Okay? There are some high-performing athletes here, I'm certain of it. But the vast majority of people here have very average or below average bodies. Okay? I'm a body fascist. I judge myself first and foremost, and then I make suppositions about the fitness and otherwise of sports people. It's a habit I've got from being a track and field athletics coach. Like all physical impulses, staring has a history sedimented over time and across space that is specific to each culture, which in turn shapes the meanings and practices. The intensity of our physical urge to stare has been strictly monitored by social rules, hence telling our children not to stare, and has strictly monitored by social rules ranging from ancient rituals to protect the evil eye to the modern day mother's experience. Okay, and it's fathers as well. It's a very sexist language from Rosemary Garland Thompson. This urge to stare is something that's quite interesting, and it doesn't exist here as much. It did for me when I arrived, because I was coming to a transplantation games for the first time and I was expecting to see athletes. And I saw people who love to do sport, which isn't bad, but I was expecting something different. So I was staring. And people were staring back at me. Who's the guy with the dodgy hand? And does he have an transplant? Okay? It works both ways. And Shelley's notion of Frankenstein, building a body of what's left over. And it's Herman Munster up there from the fictitious cartoons. He's a lot less frightening than the Frankenstein monster. But Frankenstein would be stared at. But we're not doing transplantation to such an extent these days, at least as if the surgeons that were around are to be believed. And it comes to this notion of Young Frankenstein is an interesting film too, as well as the Munsters. Young Frankenstein, starring Marty Feldman and Gene Wilder. When they go through the different kinds of brains, and they get to the last brain, and Marty Feldman drops it. And there's a name on that brain. And you've got various famous people's brains in these pickle jars in formaldehyde. And the brain that's dropped, they decide to use. And the name, they said, the name on the brain is Abby. Abby who? Abby Normal. And they give the Frankenstein monster this quote-unquote abnormal brain. And it starts the comedy spiel in the film and these sorts of things. But it's really, really important. How do we define what abnormal is and what normal is? I would argue, again, I said this at the beginning, vulnerability is the only human constant for everyone. Because those of you who are healthy and fit and sitting in the room will eventually succumb to some form of impairment, even if it's just moments before you meet your maker. Visibility versus invisibility and difference. And on the left, we have Oscar Pistorius, a Paralympian once celebrated for his great feats and his ability to compete with the normal man. And on the right, you've got a superhuman athlete, a transplant patient, who the title of my presentation comes from his achievement. He's the world record holder in the 110-meter hurdles at 12.8 seconds. Less than a year ago, he received a kidney from a family member, and less than a week ago, he ran 13.22 seconds for 110-meter hurdles. Unfortunately, it's not a Hollywood ending just yet, because he finished fourth at the American trials for the Rio Olympic Games. 1/100th of a second from finishing second. So it's a very, very tight race, but this shows, perhaps given the appropriate medical backup and so on, and no doubt he has the money and fortune to do that. And he was fortunate to have a living donor that was so closely related. But less than a year, he was able to achieve this amazing feat. But his difference isn't visible unless he shows his scar. Okay? And that's a big thing. And we have to remember that staring is a pedagogical, it's an opportunity to learn. And it's a way of dealing with difference. It's a way of making sense of our world. I'm not telling you not to stare. What I'm telling you to do, or what I'm suggesting that you shouldn't do, is categorize the people or items that you stare at. If you put them in different categories, that's fine. But as soon as you add them to a hierarchy, it becomes problematic, because there are those things that are normal and there are those things that are abnormal, and we need to get away from that thinking. So the idea of living donor and the opportunities of being hugely physically fit And I don't know whether that's a world record. It's certainly a world record for a transplant patient to run that fast in the 110-meter hurdles. And if he was from any other country other than the US, he would be going to the Olympics. Okay? And that time would make the Olympic final. Is that and it'd be interesting to discuss with the folks that understand about kidneys whether that is actually, you know, recovery to that time. He will run faster than 13:22 this year. So he will be within 4/10 of a second within the world record by the end of the athletic season. And what does this tell us about the times from being a transplant patient to being an athlete? This may be a very specific case, and no doubt there's loads of money involved, including sponsors and all these sorts of things, but it tells us something. The story, obviously, of Oscar Pistorius took a rather sordid and sad turn, so I won't say anything more about that now. What we're talking about with the therapeutic use of human body parts and the use of things like prosthetic limbs and wheelchairs is something called cyborgification, the creating of a human-machine organism. Now, it will be argued by many of the people that have been transplanted that they're still human and so on and so forth, obviously. But there is something that's not their own in their body. Just like the prosthetic limbs of Oscar Pistorius, which allow him to move, so too the organs allow life and movement as a part of that. This idea of the organic and the technical. And obviously the organs that are going into the body in most cases are 100% organic. But it's these boundaries that we need to look at. What does humankind mean? And there are certain transformations that occur to somebody who acquires a disability. Not somebody like me, congenitally impaired, who knows no different. Okay? I learned how to walk late in life. I was 2 years old. My parents took me to a hospital. I hadn't learned how to walk. And what's wrong with my kid? He can't walk. And through diagnosis and so on, they said, oh, he's got CP and so on and so forth. And you need to fuse his ankle, have an operation, and everything will be okay. And my father, who is a sports guy, said, but if you fuse his ankle, he'll never be able to run. But in the 1960s, that's what you did with people that were born with hemiplegia. In order to make them walk, you fused their ankle. Now, my father left the hospital with my mother and so on without having my ankle fused. A couple of days later, I got a small brace. It was put on me, and within 24 hours, I was able to walk. But the doctors kept saying to my father that you'd have lots of trouble because of not having your ankle fused. In the process of my sports career, I ruptured my Achilles tendon 3 times on my affected side. Now that is problematic, but the amount of joy and pleasure I've got out of running offsets that rather nicely. So the merging of the medical influence is really, really important. The power of medicine to change people's lives. If I'd been from a working class family whose parents were not educated to make those choices, they would have sat back and say, okay, fuse his ankle if that's what you think's best. And I would not have been able to run. And my life would have been less pleasurable. These sorts of issues, no doubt. I can't find much research. I can't find social scientific research on transplantation sport. So if anyone knows of material, I'd love to hear about it. But there's no, the numbers and so on that at times put me to sleep because they scare the life out of me, that we've seen over the last few days, don't talk about issues about class. They don't talk about gender. They don't talk about race and ethnicity. They don't talk about the social issues. And those really need to be unpacked. Who is getting access to organs and so on and so forth. And there will be decisions made not for medical reasons. And that is worrying. And the process of going through a transplantation, there is enough sort of social psychological literature that talks about ideas of transformation and these sorts of things. Just a brief word about the tribes of transplantation. This sense that, you know, one of my conclusions after seeing Merritt's run at the US trials is, do kidney transplant patients need transplantation sport? Okay? It's a question that needs to be asked. I'm not saying that, you know, kick them out of the movement or anything, but there are these different groups, and there are certain stigmas associated with different types of transplantation. The effect of alcohol on livers, for example, has an impact on the way in which assumptions are made about liver transplant patients. The lungs, you know, when you're talking about transplanting lungs, I was thinking about this. This is one of the things that makes you think about you know, what would they take of me? I've signed the organ donor's card, but I'm getting a bit old now. But what would they take of me? I've got a really high VO2 max from all the running I've done. Maybe they'd take my organs, my lungs, because of that. And is an athlete that gets lungs from somebody who's had a higher VO2 max at an advantage over an athlete that gets lungs from somebody who didn't do sport in the past? And how does that play out in the context of organizing sport for transplantation patients? The heart, hugely significant. Does it change who a person is? The social mythology around the heart, the center of courage, and so on and so forth, I'm not saying that it does, but all this sort of literature is out there. The heart is a hugely mythological organ in our bodies, much more so than the others that we're talking about here this week. And why is there this tribalism? The tribalism is a result of the medical fraternity power. Do we need physiotherapists who work on kidneys and kidneys alone? Why can't they work on livers? Are they not bright enough to adapt the system to work on livers? No, it is a structure of the medical system that is structuring and organizing the way transplantation sport is working, in my humble opinion. So how do we deal with some of these things? Within the world of adaptive physical activity, there is a huge problem. And I'm not offering it as a solution, but I'm saying that one of the things that happens in adaptive physical activity is you get these recipe books. If somebody with CP, cerebral palsy, shows up and they don't walk and they're in a wheelchair, you do X with them. If somebody who's 2 years past transplantation with a kidney, you should do Y with them. It needs to, and this is one of the things that's been ringing in my ears all the time, it needs to be individualized. But all too often, the medical fraternity does not allow that to happen because of the structures that are in place. McIntyre tells us we are all dependent, rational animals. But the normal in the world fail to see that. We shun this idea of vulnerability. We shun the idea that we need to have individuals around us. We need to see impairment, and by that I'm talking about impairment in the Paralympic sense and impairment in the sense that you have an organ that's not your own. Needs to be seen as normal because we all get there in the end. Physical activity needs to be more inclusive. Transplantation sport needs to think about where it's going and needs to avoid the tribalism that's predicated on a medical system that is not often fit for purpose. We need to celebrate difference, and we need to, as a society, become more inclusive. For those involved in transplantation sport and the organization structure of it, you need to be wary of commercialization. You need to be wary of people that come and say, we're going to sponsor the World Games, because that comes at a cost. And it comes at a cost of changing the community culture. The community culture did exist in Paralympic sport. And I'm not saying the Paralympics is all wrong, but it is a different organization. It is organized and structured differently, and many people with physical impairments cannot engage in Paralympic sport because their impairments are not catered for within the Paralympic framework. And all too often in the West, certainly, Paralympic sport is associated with disability sport. And the two are not the same. Disability sport covers a whole host of different impairment groups, whereas Paralympic sport only covers a small number. The big questions are the questions of power and control in medicine. Try to avoid commercialism at your peril, and take heart from what's going on here in Finland with the Finnish Sports Association for Persons with Disability. The fact that they embrace, and it might be due to the size of the country, but the fact that physical impairments and transplantation individuals are looked after by the same organization is really, really heartwarming, and it might be the way forward. Thank you very much.